Hey, it's Ross Payton with Role Playing Public Radio. This is RPPR episode 193, Designing Monsters for RPGs, with Greg Stolze and Caleb Stokes. As you might tell, we have two guests here today. Long-time RPPR collaborator, Caleb Stokes, and of course, and a more recent podcast collaborator, Greg Stolze.
Yes. Good to be here.
Yeah.
Can't wait to be in front of a tribunal and that be my sentence. After the revolution. Podcast collaborator. To the wall.
Okay, I was trying to put a positive spin on it.
Backwards into hell, you bastards. Recording this for my Patreon right now. You'll never stop me. Yeah.
Yep.
Let's run a poll. Who wants me shot in the heart? Who wants me shot in the head? Wow, the write-in painful gut shot is getting more traction than I hoped.
The revolution will be televised behind a paywall. Yeah.
Also, Greg, this is a bit unusual to be recording a podcast with you where all of the members of the podcast are on the same continent. So that is nice, at least internet connection wise. So it'll be novel, at least for us.
Well, we all have basically the same accent. Yeah, I'm expecting you to put some banjo music in the background to hype up the Americanness of it.
Oh yeah, we need some Ken Burns in this. Just some panning shots of old postcards. Dearest Martha, the podcast were brutal today. Many were sent as collaborators. In this episode, we're going to be talking about our various philosophies and approaches to designing monsters for role-playing games. There's a lot of different ways to do that. And I recently designed a monster. I ran a scenario with it. The monster is called the Death Stratum. And for my before we get in the episode proper, my plug
was that Strata?
Stratum. Death Stratum.
Okay.
Yeah. Because it is a layered monster. It has many layers each. I was
going to say, it's like a death slod, only it's also kind of like an Italian casserole.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, the basic idea for the Death Stratum is it absorbs the environment where a person has died or suffered horribly. So if a person's been tortured to death in a concrete basement, it becomes concrete. But then if it finds someone who's murdered in the woods, then it develops a layer of wood around the concrete. So you have to destroy each layer in order to get to the meaty core of the monster. But you can get a full write-up of the Death Stratum if you sign up for my email newsletter, which I'm starting up. So you can check that out. There'll be a link in the show notes, but it'll be a bi-weekly newsletter with original content and articles that I write, links to interesting things, and of course, mentions of all the podcasts and other projects I'm working on at the time. So it's something I've been wanting to do for a long time, and I just haven't gotten around to doing it, but now I have. And you get a free monster when you sign up. So Caleb, you have something coming up, Delta Green wise, at least, I believe.
Yeah, I doing a lot of work over at Delta Green Dead Channels, and on the 28th, we're introducing a bunch of streamers and YouTube personalities to Delta Green with a Detweiler scenario. So that should be fun to watch. This is going
to go great.
Yeah, that should be fun to watch live. Yeah, see the hope drain out of their eyes. In live.
And that's on
that's going to be Wednesday the 28th at 6 p.m.
All right, so on a scale of unsurvivability with one being, I don't know, what's the introductory one from the role-playing game with the thing?
Last Things Last, yeah.
Okay, so one's Last Things Last. 10 is Artifact Zero.
Yep.
Where would you put?
Yeah.
Where would you put Ex Oblivione?
I'd put it 8. The threats are terrestrial, but there's a lot of them. Yeah.
All right.
It's no Tillinghast radiation. I did consider just being welcome to Delta Green. Fuck
here's
you.
Here's the deep end of the pool.
Area.
If you're one of the people streaming, yeah, don't listen to this part. But yeah, that doesn't really help you anyway. So
It will not. Okay,
yeah.
so would you say more or less deadly than the last equation? The last equation's more soul crushing than body crushing, I'd say.
Yeah, it's definitely more deadly in terms of
That's the
your
question I
agent's
put
going
it
to
like
go
in a
on to
5
another
or a 6,
adventure. Yeah.
honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's what I like about it. You gotta,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you gotta have something that they will come out of, and
Mm-hmm.
they survive to tell the next team, oh, this isn't that bad.
I'm pretty sure I could survive the last equation because, like, I'm too dumb regarding math to
Yeah.
understand any of that shit. I'd just be like, man, these folks sure are crazy. Bunch of numbers over there. Crumple it up, trash can, like, go on to solve the... Like, that would be me. I would not...
The boss said remove all the. Yeah.
I might not notice it's supernatural in the last equation. I'm that dumb. So, like, I think I could get through that one.
Math with Greek letters? No, Greek letters are for poems. Like the Iliad, which I studied as an English major.
Yeah, I'm lighting the math on fire. They're like, yes, we need to get rid of the unnatural documents. I just turn around, unnatural? Just burning the math.
The boss man said get rid of the squiggly marks, so I'm getting rid of the squiggly marks. And Greg, you've been releasing some new stuff on your Patreon, I believe.
I have. I just updated it yesterday with a short story called Got There First, in which I follow my usual route of building up to a horrible, horrible revelation from alien intelligences, but in this case, it's funny. Still kind of horrifying, but funny. So yes, there's all kinds of stuff up there. You can hop on for a mere $5 a month and get each story as they come out. Mm-hmm. Or for $10, you get on the Discord with me, and get the direct line to me complaining about the aches and pains of my aging body. And also you get all the other fiction that's already been released with.
Ooh, nice.
Just more than one, now that I think about it, more than one story about witches and romantic problems. So those are extremely fun.
Nice.
Had just way too much fun with that.
Cool. So yeah, I'll have a link to that in the show notes as well. But yeah, speaking of, but not just witches, but monsters, actually.
Monsters.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to make monsters for a role-playing game. And like the monster that I made, the Death Stratum, I'd sort of characterize it as kind of like the monster of the week. Like the idea is it is the focus of a scenario. Like the monster is essentially a puzzle or a problem to be solved by the player characters and is sort of the main thrust of the scenario. And you see this a lot. Like another example I was thinking of is, I don't want to spoil like Ex Oblivion, but like the spoilers for one of the original Delta Green scenarios, Convergence.
Convergence.
There is actually a couple of monsters, but they're all related. These proto flesh creations of the Migu running amok, and the player characters have to deal with them, and that's sort of the figuring out what these new things do and how to stop them while not trying not to die is sort of the focus of it. But I've kind of characterized how to create monsters in different ways, and just before we get into that though, I kind of like each of you. Well, Caleb, what do you think of when creating monsters? How do you characterize them? Because I can list like 5 different ways I think monsters are created for RPGs, but I kind of think it would be interesting to see what you think of like. So aside from scenario, monster of the week kind of things, how do you think monsters are created? Like in terms of approaches.
I typically work backwards from like it sounds dumb and up its own ass because it is, but it's like I work backwards from the metaphor of the monster most of the time.
Okay.
So like, when the marionettes in Bryson Springs, like those things I designed, that was about, and I've done other stuff with Bast and God's Teeth. That's really about a fear about a lack of agency. About an inability to truly own your own choices considering the number of variables upon which they are contingent, and the terror of seeing that for the first time, and like the puppet on the strings, and those kinds of that's why it's there, to sort of represent that backwards. And so, like, yeah, that's one way I will do it when I'm feeling my oats, so to speak. Another way is I will just steal, because it's a fucking game and we just need to play. So, like, yeah, the Marionette's partially inspired by a Thomas Ligotti story. Yeah, I started Delta Green Dead channels by just openly stealing a John Linegan monster from the Wide Carnivorous Sky, because it's very cool and it was fun to play in Delta Green. I think that's fine too if you're not publishing it, which I'm not. You just want to play a game with your friends. That's how this whole thing got started. I think there's generally what would be considered higher artistic motivations, and then motivations considering the material reality of running a tabletop RPG. That would be how I typically split them in my head when I'm designing a monster.
I actually had thematic as one of my categories too, but my example, I was actually very similar in kind of ways. Was thinking of like a lot of Ravenloft monsters are very thematic. Of course, they're also stealing too. Because like the example, I think it was the Carionettes, which are monstrous puppets, and that's from the Ravenloft domain that's controlled by a evil Pinocchio. Like that's Ravenloft's whole shtick, was like, let's take classic monsters and D&D them, and so even
but in Edwardian Gothic dress, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because that's Ravenloft shtick in a nutshell. Is here's our not Dracula, here's our not, well, we also have a lich, but which, don't worry about it, it's a lich. So Greg, what are some of the approaches you use with designing?
Well, I would also, the most recent monsters I've designed are the Mighty Dreamers for Dying Breath, where I'm like, okay, so you've got, on one end of a continuum, you've got Call of Cthulhu horror, which is completely unknowable and alien and extrinsic to you. And on the other end, you've got Unknown Armies horror, which is extremely human, and it's all one continuous self-own of human suffering, where it's like, oh, well, the reason things are so bad for you is that it's good for somebody for things to be bad for you. And so I'm like, is there some way I can smush these together or find a third way or a middle path? And so I was looking for, okay, well, so the answer would be human beings becoming inhuman, becoming these inscrutable agglomerations of human traits that are no longer expressed in human lives, that it's just this maelstrom of bad leftover energy that remains after people perish. And that's sort of, if you know what the mystic concept of an egregore is, let me put this out there for you're like 3 podcast listeners who won't know what an egregore is. The idea is that people together create thought forms that have an independent reality. And an example of a modern egregore is like Santa Claus. Everybody knows who Santa Claus is. Everybody can draw you a picture of Santa Claus, even though you don't have to go to Santa Claus school and learn about Santa Claus. It's just a thought form nobody, no one individual came up with, but it has accrued. And so the idea that I came up with is, when a bunch of people die in close proximity at the same time, they get wedged together and you get this emergent new entity. And it's not happy about being the smushed together residue of 10,000 people who died in horrible pain. So that was the most recent one I came up with. And it was, taking this long English major review. But I mean, the reason for that is that, boy, it is hard to scare people with a deep one now, right?
Oh, yeah.
It is... Horror fans in particular are jaded and they love novelty because they love the thing that can hop out, and you're like, I'd never thought of that before. I never thought that I should be scared of, I don't know, my power cord. The guy who finds out a way to make power cords scary is going to be, it's going to be great. But so with experienced horror players, they're really jaded. They've got this tolerance up there. It's like trying to get someone drunk when he's used to putting down a pint of vodka a day. You got to put the work in. So Caleb, if your Twitch streamers are not horror fans, you may not need the dosages you're used to administering to scabby old horror junkies like me and Ross. You may be just like, why are these guys getting so freaked out over the intro?
Yeah.
Look, I seek to write horror like I smoke weed, which is mids is for cowards. Go. The dosage is what the dosage is. You adjust knowingly. But yeah, no, I get the English majors thing. One thing I do to try and counteract the jadedness, and I guess this is why I have this more satirical horror bent in Hebanon stuff, is I don't really focus on making the monster original so much as putting the monster in an original system. So like zombies, I remember the zombie game in Red Markets. It's not about the terror of a zombie. It's about the terror of not having the zombie be a metaphor for capitalism, not have the zombie be it is a function, it is a farmable resource. It is now subservient and entirely behested by capitalism, and so is everything else in your life, and so is your flesh and your family members, and the zombie is just there to show you that. It's not there to be anything worse than your typical body horror. It's kind of what I'm trying to do with the Traveler in Body Team, which is another thing that's on Delta Green Dead channels. The monster is not innately scary, except that it is interested in politics, and you live in a world that is completely unable to deal with that, where politics, there's no handle on it. There's nothing you can move to change it from one way or the other. The meme is going to be what it's going to be. The crab pit will keep snipping, and and that's what it's there to show you. Not, it's got tentacles and scales and shit. It's meant to talk about. So I think the monster as metaphor, you can sort of salvage monsters that are otherwise trite at this point in some horror movie. But the thing is, you have to make what that monster is depicting actually scary. It can't just be your typical Dawn of the Dead, it's in a mall, so it's about consumerism, it's about consumerism. Yeah, they're eating the things in the mall, but you really want to talk about what horrors of consumerism are you experiencing right now that I can defamiliarize, so you realize that this is not something that you should feel anxiety about just at a table with your buds. It is a deeper thing. So that's one move I've tried to get past the thing that Greg says. Obviously, it was yeah, you're not going to scare anybody with a fucking deep one in 2022.
Unless, the things I've done with deep ones in novels is,
I love the deep ones in Mask of the Other. Yeah,
is that no, man, they love us.
Yeah.
They see us as these pitiful creatures that they can improve and elevate, and it hurts them to be out of the water interacting with us, but they do it because they want to inject their superior DNA into us and make us them. And I'm like, that's relevant. The idea, that there's someone out there who's like, I'm going to do what's best for you, whether you like it or not.
ethical imperialism. Yeah.
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 The Laundry Files novels does actually not quite the same, but they have diplomatic relations with the Deep Ones, and they have like treaties, and there's many mentions in the novels where like if we violate the Benthic treaties, they're going to like it's not going to be a war; they're just going to annihilate us. Like they have weapons of mass destruction we can't even conceive of. So like we have to follow the treaties. We can't do this. So like. So like the idea that there's just this incredibly powerful civilization at the bottom of the sea that could destroy us at a moment's notice, but they don't because they're civilized, you know?
Yeah. I think it's about taking the familiar to a different context, which is really just, the general psychological movement of horror in the first place. Yeah.
Well, okay. A couple thoughts that, Alistair Stewart, the guy behind Pseudopod, the host, he had a quote, and I can't remember who it's from because I'm quoting at a remove, but it was, horror is the sensation of seeing something approach. It was probably Laird Barron or someone who said that. And this can be very hard to do in a gaming situation because it's like, well, you can't just end with seeing it approach, or you can't do that more than once. It's got to be an arrival. You have to deal with it. You're going to interact with this thing. Another sort of big picture thought about horror that I've heard is, all an apocalypse really is when you perceive what was there all along, but you never saw it. And that seemed really relevant this century, honestly, that it's just like, I just did not, people told me things were this bad, but I didn't think they were this bad.
So, yeah, like in Eclipse Phase, like a lot of the monsters into, threats that you face are sort of justified in the game's lore. And for example, like the Exurgents, which were created by the Titans, this powerful AIs in the setting, they say, okay, well, they had war, before the Titans went rogue and released the Exurgent virus, there were automated war machines, and so, well, they infected, so like the monster you fight is an infected war machine, or infected like nurse drones, and so like you face these horrible like nurse robots that are like, I think that's in the scenario Glory. But yeah, there's a whole lot of settings like here's a thing, and now because of the Exurgent virus, it's been turned into this horrible mutated, biomechanical monstrosity that wants to murder and infect everybody. And so it's the common thing becoming uncommon. So I think that's
if they'd really been thinking, the letter Q would have been involved in the name of that somehow. But
but yeah, exactly. But there's justifying the monster through the in-game lore. Well, because of the setting we have established, it would make sense for this monster to exist. I guess a related approach would be like the ecosystem. A lot of D&D monster manuals all have the the ecology of the monster. And even
these 16 skeletons and 4 goblins and 2 wyverns have lived side by side in harmony for years until you damn adventurers showed up.
Well, like even in Red
with your gold hunger, they were just hanging out. It was a rainbow coalition of a community.
But like your aberrants, like that's I think an ecological thing. It's like, well, if there's the blight and just common casualties and zombies, like, well, it makes sense that they would mutate and become like weird messed up forms like the ganglia and marionettes and that kind of thing. So, or not marionettes, but dead ringers or any number of the other variants that have been popping up. So
I use the aberrants to sort of I think I didn't predict this by any means, but like I think COVID makes the point I had about this evident to everyone. Like the way we normalize like death and terror and like massive casualties, like literal casualties in the modern day, like my aberrants are my resistance to that. Like, yes, you live an awful grinding existence, shooting things that look like people in the head and rifling through their pockets. But you've been doing that for 5 years, and that's how all the food in your belly got there and all your clothes got on your back. And it's another day at the office. And aberrants are to say, no, like, this is wrong. This is always wrong and impossible and broke reality. And just because, like, in your limited human existence, you've had to normalize it because, like, you got to pay the fucking bills. It doesn't mean that it ever stopped being horrifying and wrong and other. And that's why I put those in there, because I always wanted to push back against the going full Juan of the Dead, like we're starting a joke zombie killing business.
Right.
Yeah.
What's Juan of the Dead?
Juan of the Dead is a Cuban zombie movie where Cuba gets infected with a zombie virus, and a guy named Juan opens a business to kill zombies. But like as a hustle, it's like a comedy. Yeah.
Yeah, like you can't kill grandma. I don't know your grandma. I'll kill grandma.
Yeah. Which is a premise in red markets. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think like the only really other approach I can think of is like these are role playing games. They're not just narratives, they're games. And so designing monsters for the purpose of a game, like mechanic or system or like encounter. So like the big examples all come from D&D, right? Like there's a lot of stories about how a lot of the OG D&D monsters were made. The two examples I can think of are like piercers and mimics. Piercers are made so like you would have to like be afraid of like things falling on you, and mimics are like let's make treasure chests scary, because like the first time you get eaten by a mimic, well, like, oh my god, then the second time you see a treasure chest, you're like, ah, fuck,
I'm gonna hit this with my stick before I open it.
Yeah, exactly. So there's always
one,
this tell.
One way or another, whatever is coming out, whatever's inside there is coming out. I hope it's gold, but I'm ready for it to be guts. Weird guts.
I mean, and the fact, one of the things I really like is there have been a couple artists on the internet who have made like what modern mimics would look like. So like mimic cell phones and trash cans and like all these other devices and technological things. It's just like, what if it was actually a mimic and, your car tries to eat you, or your cell phone, takes a bite out of you. So there's, but like that's designing it not because it makes sense in the game, not because of a theme, but because you want a cool encounter. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that per se. It just depends on the type of game you're doing.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking about Rain now, right? With the some time in the future, I'm going to hold the print volumes of that in my hand, and it's going to be great. And one of the core of Rain is, leadership, and you're not just a band of rogue chaos agents rhyming and stealing across the landscape. You have responsibilities, but you also have the advantage of being in charge of some kind of organization or enterprise. It's a cult, it's a thieves guild, it could be an actual country. And so I'm like, well, what are the monsters that you need a literal army to fight? And so some of the not even fight, but deal with. And so one of some of the things that have worked into Rain are basically megafauna. There are monsters the size of hillsides that they don't pay attention to people because people are too small. They just jump into an area, leaving a crater a mile across. So if you're around when that happens, you're just fucked. But then they're just sitting there sucking nutrients out of the soil. And if you can get inside them and become you become the invasive organism. You are the bacterium that is going to kill this giant thing. And so
yeah,
I'm like,
that's cool.
and you will have other competing groups trying to kill the thing first, or trying to get to the good bits. Cause it's like, oh yeah, well, if you go all the way down here, you'll find this little sac attached to what we think are the kidneys, and that's where all the indigestible minerals go. And it can digest most minerals, but not diamonds, gold, or silver. So
empty the treasury. Yeah.
yeah, see you at the kidney sack, baby.
Oh man. There actually is an RPG called Belly the Beast where you live inside a continent-sized monster that eats cities. And basically like the terrain is like how like the things that are eaten recently are more intact as it then proceeds through the monster, gets more and more
The
messed up.
13th Age has a dungeon that the
Eyes of the Stone Thief.
yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah, that's right.
It
Yeah.
moves through the ground like an invasive root system. Yeah.
I could see like I do want to do like a modern day kaiju type game where like the encounters are just surviving the kaiju as it stomps around, and like you could even have like Cloverfield kind of parasites dropping off of it at some point or something like that.
The Cloverfield parasites are going to be, your fellow humans. It's going to be, yeah, if you get stepped on by Chadzilla or whatever you call this thing, it's
well, now it's Chadzilla.
you're gone. But once it's gone by, there are going to be all these entitled chuds who are shoving you out of the way to get on the last subway train out of Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways to make monsters.
Chads and Chuds coming in 2023 from Ross Payton.
Ooh, yeah, there we go. That's the next big Kickstarter. It's got that alliteration that's good for RPGs. I don't see a problem with that. So I kind of want to know like if there's any things you when you're designing monsters that to avoid. I know like from published games, there's or if you've read published RPGs, you're like, oh god, this is a bad monster. This war is terrible. Because I know for me, my go-to example for bad monster design is of course Rifts, the role-playing game, because they have so many of them, and like it's how they write them more than anything else. They might have a good idea, but if you're not familiar, the Rifts approach to writing a monster is to give it incredibly detailed, unnecessary stats. Give it a very long write-up that has nothing to do with how it works. Give it way too much or too little health for what it can do. Like there was this monster that like I was looking at on a live stream, and it's like, oh, it can climb through the trees at 50 miles an hour. What? It has a climb speed of 50 miles an hour through trees? Like what the fuck? Why was it just bouncing through trees at highway speeds? And it's like a 20-foot tall like monster that can fight a tank. Like it made no sense. It weighed several tons. But like
yeah, it can go through it can travel across a tree at 50 miles an hour once.
Yeah.
And it's usually accompanied by a squad of lumberjacks gleefully cackling behind it.
Yeah, exactly. But like, I mean, part of it is just the system-wide thing, like how Rifts just writes any stat up because it has a very long write-up, which is incredibly padded, and then like the stats block is incredibly long for what it needs to do, and so like it takes. I mean, they give it like an entire character skill like write up. It gives it all kinds of skills. Like, oh, do we really need to know the monster can operate radios and and knows first aid and like all these other languages. Like,
I'm just picturing the 20-foot tall tree monster after it's demolished you in a shower of splinters. Now bandages you up. It's like, you owe me your life. I'm gonna collect on this debt. Take this radio.
Take the radio.
Someday this radio is gonna call, and that's gonna be me.
Yeah, I'm gonna need some help. So yeah, but like, have either of you seen like or like what are your kind of like not to do when you're designing monsters?
Well, there's one thing. If you're designing something specifically for a game, and suppose you're running a superhero game and you got someone who's the Human Torch, you can once in a while throw in the fireproof monster that fights him to force him to be clever or rely on teamwork. But it's one of those things where he did not choose the Human Torch hoping that he would run into a series of things that cannot be solved by vitamin F.
This guy has kryptonite too. Yeah.
Yeah.
This guy has kryptonite too.
I actually remember seeing a lot of that, actually, now that I think about it, in old World of Darkness books, like, especially for boss monsters. Like, it's like, this elder vampire is immune to this, and he can do this, and he can do this, so you can't do shit against him. Yeah, he's 1,000 years old, and he just woke up, but don't worry, he's got something that'll defend him against automatic guns. Like, which is like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks. Our one advantage over the ancient vampire we're trying to kill, and he's got a spell against that. Awesome.
I actually stuck that in a piece of World of Darkness fiction that never wound up getting published. But you know, the ancient, horrible older vampire has woken up and is trying to figure things out. And the one advantage our protagonist has is, you know, this guy hasn't seen any technological advances since 1492, and his cell phone goes off, and the elder's like, "What's that?" And he's like, "It's a music box. If you open it up, it plays for Elise."
Amazing.
And the elder's like, "You're too eager."
Yeah. But yeah, that is I mean, sometimes you write that up just because, like, I have this monster you're not supposed to kill, but like most of the time you are supposed to be able to kill the monster, right? Like, that's the whole point of a monster.
I mean, I think system matters here. Like, that's why it's very hard for me to be afraid of a D&D monster, even though, like, D&D tries to do horror a lot of times, and to varying success. But, like, the monster is monstrous because it doesn't exist in the same world as the characters. It's other. Your characters exist as a series of numbers on a piece of paper. So, like, while you do need to stat it out in your game terms, the more stats you add, the more deeply tied it is to being just like the player characters. And that's why when you get, like, Cthulhu eats 1d20 investigators per round, and you get these, like, ridiculous sort of mechanical translations into this thing that, I mean, that not to be a Delta Green homer just because they pay the bills. I was like, but that's what I like about it. If monster is as puzzle in Delta Green, the things that aren't the answer to the puzzle just don't fucking work. Bullets, explosions, nope. Like, yeah, it's just like you figure it out or you
better
die.
having made your loud noise, little man.
Yeah, like I still, I mean, I understand it's a call. Like, if I could disagree with the current system, it would be like, we've still got all these spells and rituals that we want, like, other, like, listed out as, like, well, here's the way you do this, and and there's, like, they've got willpower points to spend, and that's your main stat block for whatever your sorcerer or monster is. And I'm like, and like, I don't know, it just always rubs me the wrong way. Be like, what is fucking magic? Like, like, I get that there's requirements. You could make it per scenario, but, like, you've got to roll a 1d4 and blah, blah, blah. It just ties it. So I guess that's it for me. Like, I always try to avoid tying whatever the threat is too much to the mechanics of the game. It's not just GM fiat, it kills you because I say it does. I want there to be chances to affect it. I want there to be player agency. And so that can be used to, you know, manipulate fear reactions and stuff. But there's a sweet spot for that. And then, like, here's page 18 of this Rifts monster that does 2,000 mega damage to glitter boys on days that end in Y. And, like, yeah, like, that just, you can never make that scary for me.
Well, I don't think Rifts wanted to be scary.
No.
Rifts wanted to be awesome.
I know, but, like, I see it happen in, like, some Call of Cthulhu projects that overly stat the monster and then get confused when the players are just like, well, if it's got that many armor points, what if I just got an even bigger gun? And then that ends up blowing up the climax of the scenario, literally. I just think in general you can't get too simulationist for a thing that is supposed to trigger in the characters as being outside accepted reality or morals.
See, you're viewing monsters from the horror description, and you know, if you want to view monsters from the adventure description, then now absolutely it's like, oh, it's a puzzle you can solve. Oh, it's a challenge you can overcome. Oh, if you figure out its deal and you can communicate with it, maybe you can sell it your shoes and it'll give you free passage and you won't have to start the spanking machine. So,
yeah, I guess, yeah, I mean, genre matters, not just system, because, so, like, I
would say genre probably matters more, and that system determines genre in a lot of ways. You may think your game is a horror game, but if it's got rules that are going to let your players overcome everything, guess what, pal? It's actually a pulp game.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes monsters aren't even necessarily like puzzles you solve or enemies you defeat. They're world building, you know, like there's in the current campaign I'm running Cointract Island, which is like, you know, Jurassic Park and Resident Evil and BioShock. There's like all these monsters that are just like side things that are just like here's what the boys in the lab cooked up this week, and it's like, oh, that's weird and messed up and also kind of horrible, and like we're gonna have to deal with this thing, we're gonna just bypass it. Like, oh, they took slugs and grafted and made them giant and grafted it to computers and a vending, and so now it's a moving slug-like vending machine that like hawks energy drinks at you and sort of
Please buy a Red Bull. If you buy a Red Bull, my pleasure circuit will be engaged.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's like they, you know, there's an encounter where you have to
Why
get around.
Why did they make it talk? I've never wanted a Red Bull less.
Yeah, but you'll buy the Red Bull because you feel bad for it. So yeah, so now it's just world building.
Please, I have not had pleasure in several days.
Fictional libertarians are so much better than real libertarians. Fictional libertarians, you free them from like a municipal tax burden and they become Dr. Moreau inside a fucking hour. Just instantaneous, like mad science, crazy. But like real libertarians do that. They just like either end up, the town gets eaten by bears or like it just becomes a sex trafficking ring. Like, it's one of two things. Like, so boring as compared to, like, I'm going to build dinosaurs. Yeah. I'll build an undersea drug addict emporium. Like, way better. Way cooler in fiction. Yeah.
In terms of designing monsters, aside, you know, we talk about, like, our approaches and, you know, what not to do. Like, in terms of just the sort of nuts and bolts of it, like, when you're designing a monster, I guess there would be a difference in like, is this the focus of the scenario? Is this the focus of the game session? Or is this like sort of an incidental side thing? What other kind of factors, what else is a consideration for you when you design a monster? I know like a lot of times I try and vary like one personal preference I have are intelligent monsters versus animalistic, because I read this interview once with Clive Barker where he said one of the reasons why he made Hellraiser is because he wanted a monster that could talk and explain why it did what it did, so it could have a conversation with the protagonist. I thought, oh yeah, that's really good. So like, and like, you know, in Cointract Island, most of the things are animalistic, but like some of them can talk or communicate in a meaningful way. And I like that.
If you don't like Red Bull, how about a refreshing Sprite?
Exactly. Yeah.
Sorry, I should stop doing that, but I just
can't.
And
also for the record, it's just a little like computer speaker that plays tunes that represent its emotions. So it's a happy little chiptune song or a sad little chiptune song, depending on whether or not you buy it. And it has a little like LED screen with a little happy face or a sad face. It shows emojis at you. Yeah. So, but yeah, so that's a personal preference, is to have intelligent monsters so they can talk back. Like what I guess some of the other things you do when you're designing monsters in terms of like preferences or just practical considerations.
Well, how inscrutable do you want it to be? What sort of sensory language are you going to use describing it? Because you know, you can get pretty far with, if you have if they can tell from your tone of voice that you are emotionally invested. This goes a surprisingly long way, you know, here, which I'm sure makes sense to you podcasters.
Oh, what?
But
I wasn't
that-
paying attention.
What? And if you have a good quiver full of adjectives and you describe how this thing, smells and the sounds it makes going across the floor and, how certain foods are now going to become permanently unappealing to this character just from the way this thing looks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. I know with Caleb,
That's something you don't get with goblins in D&D.
No, that's true. That's true. I know with Caleb, you mentioned body team earlier. Like this is not the first time that entity has been shown, and the scenario where that was you.
I still got to listen to that.
Yeah, Delta Green Somewhere Lane, like that the initial presentation of the monster, like the way you described it and what it did is like, oh god. So like it was so well done. Like when you just had a little hook in body jumps, I instantly knew what it was. It was so recognizable. It was like, beans, shit, we're fucked. Yeah.
It's the tourist. The tourists have found us.
Yeah.
I think the animalistic intelligent thing is like one of the reasons to have the lame English majory conversation about what does this monster represent in your head, because I mean, when that's screwed up, man, is it screwed up. And like, if you want proof, good adaptations of Frankenstein, these bad adaptations of Frankenstein, like good Frankenstein needs to talk. He needs to be able to say, "You're God, and I hate you for creating me." Like, and you're going to suffer for it.
So
That's
you
like
don't like the
Frankenstein-
Karloff Frankenstein where he's just far
yeah, like what? No, I don't, because like you're just describing a dude with bolts in his neck now. Like that's not scary. Like he's hunting me over Antarctica by just walking behind me wearing a plague cloak. That's fucking scary. Like it's not just like, and like I feel like that's a case of misunderstanding. Like, what does this thing represent? Like, because this one needs to talk. Like, this one needs to be able to have a conversation because he's a philosophy monster that can still look very scary because he's made of corpse parts. But if you're just focusing on the corpse parts, it's the cyberpunk meme. Like, ooh, cool future. Like, way over the head. You've really missed the point if it's all about like stitches and electricity and Tesla coils. Yeah.
Did you read? It was Terry Pratchett's Witches Abroad. One of the most affecting scenes he ever wrote is, that, and this is again, getting back to sort of an earlier theme we touched on of, I know what's good for you. And I don't need your consent to impose what is good for you on you because it's good. And it's this woman who has the power of a fairy godmother and is trying to turn everything into a fairy tale. And they meet one of her early draft big bad wolves. And at first you're like, oh, this is a scary monster that is going to mess up our heroines, and then it's just begging to be killed. It's just, please, I need an ending. Any ending. And it's like, oh, now I see who the real monster is. It's the pretty lady with the wand saying, I'm gonna make this princess's wish come true.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you can kind of see that, like, the Frankenstein, misunderstanding Frankenstein, you can kind of see that actually happening with creepypasta now. Like, I guess the big example of that would be the Backrooms. Now, if you're not familiar, the Backrooms is a creepypasta meme about like you're just trapped in this place, an endless, infinite maze of it looks like a hotel basement, fluorescent lights that buzz very loudly, and you're just lost. And like that's the original premise, and that's just terrifying. You're just lost in this infinite maze. But like what happened is, of course, people started writing fan wikis for it and started adding monsters to it, and which is like totally misunderstanding the original horror of the Backrooms, which is like isolation and alienation. And
this maze does not need a minotaur.
Yeah, House of Leaves did not need. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because it's the exact same thing. House of Leaves, the exact same vibe, and it did not need that. So, but yeah, like it's very common. So yeah, think about the themes. That's a very good point. Before you move on to shoutouts, any other final thoughts on creating monsters, designing monsters for RPGs? Yeah.
Well, let me back out to the nature of creativity in general, right? And there seem to be two paths to creativity, and most people are somewhere. These are like ends of a continuum. And on one end, for poetry, on one end, you've got Poe, who did everything very consciously and deliberately. And on the other end, you've got Coleridge, who woke up one day with Kubla Khan in his head. But he was able to do that because he was obsessed with poetry, constantly reading it, constantly analyzing it, constantly thinking about it. So he was immersed in it enough that his subconscious could just blorp it out. Similarly, Mozart, who was introduced to classical music probably in the womb. His dad was, I think, a Meistersinger, so he was probably actually hearing professional musicians all the time, even before he was born. And his dad is like, oh, this is my chance to live out my failed dreams of glory. I'm going to make him write a symphony by the time he's 6. So, yeah, by the time he's 20, he can just sit down at a pianoforte and blorp, out comes a tune. So if you are a person who is really, really into horror and has been immersed in it since you were a little kid and, maybe have some anxiety issues, you may be able to just do it on vibes. You may be able to just, I know what scares me, and I can convey that. I can make my own neuroses contagious. But you also maybe that's not your mode, and you're more like Beethoven, where it's like, well, I'm going to have this idea, and then I'm going to think about it, and then I'm going to think about it, and then I'm going to revise it, and then I'm going to turn it over, and then I'm going to iterate it like a rock in a rock tumbler till it's smooth. And both approaches work. People who have had one work for them often tend to think the other one is just some crazy myth, but they both work. And the same writer may slide along the continuum, or the same creator. So find what works for you. If it is consciously planning it out and making an elaborate backstory, then do that. But there are going to be people for whom carefully planning it out and creating an elaborate backstory is going to be stifling, confining, and they won't have any energy when it's time to actually describe it. So, I wish I could say there's one true path, but the one true path is to recognize there are many paths.
It's true. Like the back rooms, there are many paths, and that's the joy and the horror of designing monsters. So when we come back, we'll have some shout outs. And we're back with some shout-outs. And I will begin with a video game. I did get a review key of this. So in the interest of disclosure, but I really like this game. It is called Fashion Police. It is a retro FPS available on Steam and I believe all consoles. In this game, you literally play the Fashion Police. So it does a lot of really cool things with the FPS formula. Because your enemies, you actually fix their fashion crime. So like the first enemy you fight is a businessman with bland gray suits and ties. And so your first gun is a paint gun that operates like a shotgun. And so when you shoot them with enough paint, you change the color of their tie, and they thank you, and you solve their fashion crime. And so there's other enemies with suits that are too big, and so you have to fire your tailor-made weapon at them to tailor their suits correctly. There are people with loud suits. You have to dilute their colors with your water gun. And so there's a lot of puns. There's actually a lot of references to other games in it. There's really cool movement because you have like a grappling hook thing you can use to jump through certain areas. It's just a really fun, well designed FPS. And
is there a point at which you get to yell "Freeze, motherfucker! Drop the trilby"?
Well, there's no profanity, but you do. There's something like that in there. Also, the you have like up to like 5 weapons, but like if you can't use the same weapon on every enemies. So like you can't use the tailor-made on the gray business suit because that's not their fashion crime. You can only use certain weapons on certain enemies. So like when multiple enemies are attacking you, it's actually pretty tricky to like focus fire one enemy down with this weapon and then focus on the other enemy. So it actually gets pretty tricky towards the end in how you fight the waves of enemy coming at you. So it's a really fun game.
I imagine the badges are so tasteful.
Yeah, exactly. So so it's a very fun game. Check it out. Caleb, you've been playing a game too.
Yeah, a lot of people have been playing it. It's not very underground at this point, which is good because it's fun. Cult of the Lamb is a fun little roguelike that I've enjoyed quite a bit. You play 2-dimensional animated little furry woodland creatures that are in the thrall of 4 angry gods. They all start off by sacrificing you, but you are reclaimed by their 5th brother who has been exiled, the one who waits, and you become its avatar in the forest, and basically become immortal and get a sword and superpowers. So the premise of the game is to go around defeating the creatures in the thrall of these other 4, deadly creatures for the one who waits, and then converting any you rescue over to your cult. Because the way you level up in between runs in this roguelike is you attain worship points. And you also, and the worship points unlock a base building element. So it's like Animal Crossing if you could commit human sacrifice to get a bunch of like bells. Like if Tom Nook starts talking shit, you feed him to a tentacle monster, and then everyone takes mushrooms and trips balls while watching and comes to worship you all the harder. Like it's very, very cutesy and also like dark, and I had a lot of fun playing it. So
yeah. And the dungeon like elements are like Binding of Isaac kind of like vibe, right? Or
yes,
like,
the combat is extremely simple. Like almost too simple, but
more forgiving than Hades, for example.
But worth it because I am willing to go out and kill any number of creatures in that haunted forest if it gets me like, I don't know, a better outhouse skin for pit. My base building at the clubhouse of culting. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's very much about the base building for me, but
yeah. But speaking of cute things, Greg, there's a cartoonist you were talking about earlier.
Well, she's probably best known. Abby Howard is probably best known for The Last Halloween, which I think was on was a webcomic and maybe still is. And that one I said was like 70% cute and jokes and fun and drawn in a pretty, not quite Peanuts level cute abstraction, but on that end of the spectrum. And then 30% is genuinely upsetting. But she has a book out through Iron Circus Comics called The Crossroads at Midnight, which is a series of unconnected short pieces in a more serious vein. And I don't want to say the American Junji Ito, because that's not exactly correct. But in the same way, but the similarities, Ito will do, body horror with, it's like, explanations. Pfft, we don't need, no, explanations aren't fun.
Getting in the hole is fun.
Yes, and that seem to have, and there is, you feel a specific, because it's so manga-like in Ito, and this is much more in the American tradition of comics, and you feel a little more of the American vibe to it. But they are much more disturbing than the last Halloween. And so the Crossroads at Midnight. I think my favorite one is about a woman who's, I think, a grad student, and she's really poor. And so she finds a mattress on the sidewalk, and everyone's like, girl, you can't sleep on a sidewalk mattress. And she's like, no, this will be much better than the 15-year-old futon pad I'm using now. And it's not better. It's deeply disturbingly drawn. So if you like being disturbed, Crossroads at Midnight, Abby Howard.
Yay. And speaking of disturbing, I did just finish a Cody Goodfellow novel, Ravenous Dusk, which is a sequel to Radiant Dawn, which I had read back in 2020. And I finally got around to reading Ravenous Dusk. So this is a sequel. This is a very Cthulhu Mythos novel. It is incredibly Delta Green. Not like there are changes, but it gets into, it is a very deep mythos novel, but like it's also has an aspect of being a military thriller, and sort of globetrotting, and boy does the body horror ramp up to 11 in this. I don't want to spoil exactly what entity, but Cody Goodfellow's like, let's take this well-known, Lovecraftian entity and just extrapolate what it would do in these circumstances. And like, oh man, it's really gross. It's really, really gross and horrifying.
Okay.
So it is, the Ravenous Dusk is a quite longer than the original. The original novel is like 300 pages. Ravenous Dusk is like 600 pages. But so it's a bit of a read. But like, if you like Cthulhu Mythos and like Delta Green style horror, where government agencies are spying, there's military, dudes with automatic shotguns attacking mythos entities, and it not going well for the dudes with shotguns, weirdly enough. Then this is your novel. So it's a lot of fun. All right. Caleb, there was you had one other shout out, I think.
I've finally started finishing the Three Body Problem trilogy. So I'm finally on Death's End. I haven't quite finished it yet, but I like the translation. I don't know if I got a different edition, but I like this one quite a bit more than the first two in terms of raw prose styling. Might also because I like the characters a bit more thus far than especially the messianic asshole from the second one. I guess would be the way to describe the protagonist of that book, which is a unique take, but difficult to read at times. But yeah, I like it quite a bit. I think it would even fall into Asimovian horror at points. So I quite like it thus far. I haven't finished it yet, but I would recommend that trilogy overall.
Okay. I read the first one, but...
Yeah, the second one is extremely interesting as a thought experiment, and gets very interesting at point, but is a little oddly paced. But this one I thought the first one was a little oddly paced, but this one seems to be paced very well thus far. So,
cool. All
right. I should check out. I'm waiting for the delivery of my mattress, but if I can log off. Thank you for having me. This was a treat.
My only final shout out is the Vaporwave zine Visual Signals issue 7. I have an article in it where I write about my ode to YouTube Vaporwave visual mixes. But yeah, it's a well put together zine with interesting articles of things of interest to Vaporwave fans. We talk about a lot on my other podcast, Night Clerk Radio. But yeah, it's just you can read them online for free, or you can order them print copies through their website, and I'll have a link in the show notes. But again, don't forget September 28th. What time? Wednesday, September
6 p.m.
6 p.m. Central. Okay. Kale will be running Exoblimier for a. How many players do you have?
3 so far. We'll
3
see
so far. Okay. So we'll see how well they do. And don't forget the email newsletter where you can read up on my new monster, which will be featured in a one-shot on RPP Actual Play, the Death Stratum, but also a newsletter where I'll be talking about all kinds of cool stuff and posting links. And So thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.